Let's try it again. Good evening.
Good evening.
How's everyone doing tonight?
Good.
Glad that you all made it out. It's a freezing cold day. Glad to see you all in here in this beautiful warm space. I'm not going to be the person to welcome you into the General Baker Institute, but I'm very glad that you all are here. It's exciting to see you all in this space. To introduce the General Baker Institute, I'll bring up Carolyn Baker, General Baker's daughter.
I'm one of the daughters. There's another one in there hiding. But welcome to our space. This is the General Baker Institute. This is our first event at the Institute, so we were literally mopping and trying to figure out stuff, counting chairs, and so welcome. This is like the icebreaker event for the space. This is our General Baker Institute is a nonprofit named after in honor of General Baker. If you don't know who he was, feel free. There's lots of pictures you'll see of him around, and there's quotes up. Like I said, we're still working on the space. This is our 4 pillars are internationalism, arts and culture, political education, and projects of survival. So those are the 4 pillars that we're built on. So welcome to the space. Glad to have you here. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to stop me, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Oh, bathrooms. There's a bathroom on this side, and then the other one is on this side. If you go down the hall and around the corner, those are where the bathrooms are. Oh, t-shirts. Yeah, there are t-shirts there for sale and sweatshirts with General Baker Institute logo on it and quotes of General Baker's on it. Thank you.
All right, so my name is Peter Blackmer. I'm a research fellow in the Detroit Equity Action Lab in the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights at Wayne State Law. So I'm going to introduce our speakers for the night and then talk a little bit about the topic that we're going to be discussing collectively tonight, which is radical politics in the post-war era in Detroit. So our first guest is Dr. Angela Dillard. Forgive me for reading off the phone, I usually don't do this. Dr. Dillard is a professor of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, who specializes in American and African-American intellectual history, particularly around issues of race, religion, and politics, on both the left and the right sides of the political spectrum. Her second book, which she'll be talking a little bit about tonight, Faith in the City, Preaching Radical Social Change in Detroit, which was published by University of Michigan Press in 2007, focuses on the interconnections of religion and political radicalism in Detroit from the 1930s to the 1960s. Both her first 2 books reflect Professor Dillard's interest in how the study of political ideologies, how they emerge, how they got deployed in the context of political movements, and how they changed over the course of time. Professor Dillard is currently at work on the political biography of James Meredith, the icon of the civil rights movement turned conservative Republican, and has recently launched the Black Church Project, a public history initiative involving churches in Detroit and Ann Arbor. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Angela Dillard. Our second speaker is Dr. Steve Babson. Dr. Babson is a labor educator and union activist living in Detroit. He received his doctorate in U.S. history from Wayne State University, where he also worked as an instructor in the Labor Studies Center from 1985 to 2006. Steve has published 6 books, including Working Detroit, The Making of a Union Town, and Lean Work, Empowerment and Exploitation in the Global Auto Industry. He is also an organizer with Detroit Eviction Defense, a grassroots organization that fights for housing justice and resists unjust foreclosures and evictions in the city of Detroit. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Babson. Okay, so before we begin, I want to ask everyone to turn to a neighbor, preferably someone you don't know that well, someone you haven't spoken to before, get to know each other a little bit better, and explore some big picture questions that are going to frame some of the conversation that we're having tonight. So we'll take about 5-6 minutes to do this, and then we'll bring it back together and share out some of our responses. So first, this is going to sound really like a really vague and general question, but why do we study history? And then what does it mean to be radical? Let's just take another minute or two and then we'll bring it back together. All right. Let's go ahead and bring it back together. Everybody good? All right. So can we see some hands? Who wants to share out some reflections, some responses to the first question of why it's important that we study history? Why? What are the different reasons? Thank you. What are the purposes of studying history?
It's to learn from, we study history to learn from the past and basically not make the mistakes of forefathers. Thank you.
Who else has something to share?
We talked about history as a way to understand how power is legitimized in the past and today, both in like positive and negative ways.
One more? And y'all were really talkative about 5 minutes ago.
So I was talking about how history is also a way to get to know people and get to know people around you. So by the time we are given one perspective through the history books that we have in school or whatever it is, and that's very fundamental in how you're growing up and how you see the world. So it's a really good way to understand where other people are coming from and learn about others.
So we're hearing a lot of the importance of history for connecting on shared levels of humanity, the strategic uses of history to inform our ongoing collective struggles. So let's pivot into the second question of what does it mean to be radical? There's a lot of conversations going on, and it's going to be really drab if it's just me up here trying to call answers from people.
You talked about how the idea of radicalization to a lot of people, but like how it pushes boundaries and limits, and often it involves like pushing a structure past what we're used to.
Okay, who?
Can you hear me now? Okay. I'm here amongst all my old comrades and radical friends. Hi, Mitch. I think being a radical is challenging the status quo, the economic, social, political status quo that creates a hierarchy in society that may be unfair. I'll leave it at that. Also taking risks to do that.
Thank you. One more person?
I think radicalism sometimes disguises itself, or it's relative in that what might be a common sense response to conditions that are a radical departure, radical oppression, can be a radical act. It's a means of survival. Sometimes survival itself can be a radical act.
All right, so we got a lot of great ideas in the room here, and it's important that we get talking about how we define radicalism so that we can sharpen our analysis about what it means to be radical and how that shows up in our organizing theories and our organizing practice as well. So what I'm hearing a lot of is challenging the status quo, and what also comes from challenging the status quo can also be a lot of adverse consequences, right? And what we're going to talk about in part tonight are the radicalization of different forms of organizing, what it means to be radical in a different context of labor organizing, organizing for racial justice, for civil rights, for human rights, and what some of the consequences are of political radicalism as well. So some of the is that better? Can everybody hear me if I speak without this? Yeah. Okay. I'll project. So some of the key reasons why we are here tonight talking about this period in Detroit's history are bulleted up here. So if we're thinking about why it's important both for our historical knowledge and for our understanding of current power structures and current movement work in the city of Detroit and beyond, these are some of the major reasons that we need to be studying this. So first, the importance of understanding the histories and contributions of organized labor in Detroit. Second, investigating the evolution of structural racism in Southeast Michigan. Third, locating the realignment of political parties and the change in the national landscape. Fourth, to analyze the influence of left theories and praxis on labor movements. Fifth, to interrogate the relationships between race, class, and gender within labor movements. To explain the histories of political repression and identify the legacies of that today, because we're wrestling with a lot of the legacies of modes of political repression that were originated in the early 20th centuries and have evolved since. So to really understand the kind of political repression that's being experienced by organizers today, we need to know the roots of that repression as well. To trace the impacts of left, nationalist, and moderate organizations on the emergence and evolution of civil rights movements in the 1950s. So it's important for us to know that the civil rights movement doesn't just appear with Brown v. Board in 1954, as we're popularly taught in K-12 education and a lot of college courses, but there are a lot of, as what historian Rhonda Williams will call roots and expressions of black radicalism that are carrying over from particularly the Depression era and the post-war era that are informing the ways that the civil rights movement emerges and evolves by the 1950s. And so lastly, to analyze the successes and shortcomings to find and apply lessons today. And that's something that I was hearing a lot about in your sharing out of why it's important that we study history so that we can put a critical lens to the past, reckon with what worked, what was effective, what the historic context was that made particular movements effective, and on the flip side of that, what were some shortcomings of organizational efforts, and what can we learn as we're trying to move forward and learn from those shortcomings today. So, I'm going to turn it over to our two speakers now. I'm getting a little hoarse, I've been talking a lot today. But some of the guiding questions that are going to frame our discussion today are posted up here on the board. So just to give you an idea of some of the topics that we're going to cover over the next hour and a half or so, why was Detroit a hub for organized labor, and how did the emergence of strong unions in the early 20th century impact political power structures in the city, in the state, and in the nation? It's important to recognize Detroit's place not just as a local site of labor organizing, but how that reverberated beyond this region and the state. What kinds of political ideologies influenced the emergence and evolution of labor unions in Detroit in the first half of the 20th century? So we need to understand the roots of the action that was being taken. Why did unions become targets for violence and repression at the local, state, and national levels? how did population movements, especially Great Migrations, influence the political, economic, and social landscapes in Detroit? How did Detroit's black communities organize for political representation and power in the city? What roles did and have black churches and faith-based institutions played in organizing communities for civil rights and political power in Detroit? Because we also know that Detroit was an important hub for the emergence of the Nation of Islam in this era as well that we need to consider. And lastly, what lessons can young organizers learn about the intersections of community organizing, labor, political power, and political repression from this chapter of Detroit's history? So, with that kind of roadmap laid out, I'm going to turn it over to Steve. Would you like to begin?
Sure. Well,
You okay with the mic, Steve?
yeah, I think can you hear me? All right. So, we could spend much of the next week talking about the various issues outlined here and still not get to the bottom of some of these important questions. I'm going to start with a quote from Mark Twain, or at least it's attributed to him, that history does not repeat itself, but sometimes it does rhyme. And I think what we could find useful in this exercise tonight is figuring out what rhymes from our past with the circumstances that we confront today. And the way I want to frame that in terms of getting at some of the issues that have been laid out here is to contrast the contending approaches to fundamental claims about how to go about organizing working people. And that is business unionism and social unionism. And I think if we keep those two ideas in mind, we can understand a lot more about what happened in the 1930s, setting the basis for the emerging radical politics in Detroit and the transformations of political structure and the economy and demographics and all the other changes we're talking about in the decades that follow. So the 1930s is key. And by business unionism, I mean the unionism that was advocated by and organized on that principle by the old American Federation of Labor. Not entirely, there were exceptions, but most of the American Federation of Labor organized around the principle that a union, in effect, could be, in a sense, an entrepreneurial, almost, exercise, and in some unions becomes closely linked with the idea that you basically are organizing an insurance company that provides benefits for the members with a sort of top-down approach, which you deliver the goods to members who thereby are going to re-elect you to office, assuming you have internal democratic structures, and not all unions did, and that you are therefore going to be addressing a group of clients or consumers who you regard as the most appropriate and worthy of your attention as, in effect, organizing an entrepreneurial approach, in a sense. This is overstating it, but it's especially relevant when we think about a union like the Teamsters, that became, and for many years continued to be, the sort of embodiment of that business unionism, to the point where Jimmy Hoffa, while he was negotiating for truck drivers, over-the-road truck drivers, was also himself investing in truck companies and then arranging to lease those trucks to some of the companies he was bargaining with. And this was not regarded as necessarily outside the pale for a lot of folks in that business, because some of them were owners in their own right. They owned their own rigs. Some of them would then buy a few more rigs, hire a couple drivers, and they would thereby become employers. In the world of craft production that characterized U.S. industry in the 19th century and into the 20th century, that kind of blurring of the line between artisan labor and becoming your own employer and then the employer of others, that sort of fluidity of class in small-scale craft production was not uncommon. And so a lot of unions would organize around the idea, well, what is the best and most stable workforce that we can identify that is worthy of our investment, in effect, in that kind of business unionist approach. And given the white supremacy that dominated in the United States, the first choice you would make would be white workers. because most employers were only going to hire whites in any case. So it would be a labor movement, the American Federation of Labor, which was whites only. Up through actually into the 1930s, most of the unions in the American Federation of Labor were whites only. Also, you would reject immigrants, and you would reject women, and you would reject the unskilled, because all four of those groups were considered unstable and not up to the necessary commitment and attention to detail in the industry that would make them reliable, long-term basis for your business unionism approach. That's an approach which was challenged often enough well before the 1930s. The industrial workers of the world being the most obvious example. There were also industrial unions that said, we're not going to divide up workers by craft and by race and by gender and by ethnicity, which is what the AFL generally did in its basic practice. We're going to instead try to unify all workers into industrial organizations, organizing wall to wall, rather than dividing up workers into tiny little craft organizations that were becoming less relevant as industry was destroying the basis of that craft production. But the AFL stuck with craft organization, even after major companies like General Motors and Ford had taken all of those older crafts and pretty much made most of them obsolete as it automated and mechanized production and brought huge concentrations of people into factories across the landscape of Detroit and Michigan. So, we now take as sort of inevitable the organization of a different kind of unionism, an industrial unionism, not craft unionism, and a social unionism that didn't see workers narrowly defined in terms of the collective bargaining agreement or the contract you would win for them as members in that particular craft organization, whites only, men only, native born only, in most cases, but instead argued, well, the only way we can respond to a modernizing, industrial-based economy is through industrial unionism, unifying people on the basis of race, ethnicity, men and women, all in the same organization, but also with a social agenda. Meaning, in other words, you're going to approach this not as identifying them as clients for whom you deliver benefits in a business unionist way, but instead you define them by class, by social class, a working class, which therefore has a whole range of issues that are relevant and important and imperative: housing, food, health, a whole range of circumstances that have to be addressed on a community basis, on a social basis, and when you build that unity and that basis, that social base, you're more likely to be able to organize these massive, capital-intensive, not automated entirely, but increasingly machine-paced and driven. That's the only way it's going to be successful. We now look back on the 30s and we say, well, that was inevitable. How else could you organize the auto industry? The answer is that back then, up until the early 1930s, the majority opinion among academics and even many pro-union people was that it was going to be impossible to organize the big three, the auto companies, and much of the industrial terrain that we take for granted now as the traditional home of unions was regarded back then as likely to be impossible to organize. And this includes commentators who were pro-union. George Barnett, he was the head of the American Economics Association, but he was very favorable towards unions, but he said these craft divisions, these racial divisions, these ethnic divisions, pitting men against women and ethnic group against ethnic group, white against black, would make it impossible to unify people in a coherent and effective way and bring about the industrial organization that unions had tried to develop. Some of the outlier radical unions of previous generations, the industrial workers of the world, as I mentioned most obviously, but also the railroad unions. Eugene Debs comes out of that context, the effort to organize across an industrial basis. All of those had failed. And so the expectation that it would work in the 1930s was remote in the early parts of that decade, when the economy collapses, and there's only the AFL. I should make that clear. I remember when I was a kid and I joined the union when I was 16, and the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, it sounded like two different organizations because they were two different organizations. And in fact, the Congress of Industrial Organizations didn't exist until 1935. Up until then, it was just the AFL, with this craft, conservative, business unionist orientation, contested by a few outlier unions, but by and large the dominant answer to the question of how workers should organize. And they, in the 1930s, are antagonists for the next 20 years. From 1935 to 1955, they're competitors. They then unify in the 1950s, and therefore we now have an amalgam of outcomes that are hard to describe in a few minutes. And you should give me the hook when I've spent enough time trying to go through an introduction that will give us a sort of framework for discussing this. But what happens in the 1930s can, I think, best be described by answering two questions. Why does the sit-down strike wave that begins in the fall of 1936, why is it then and not years earlier when the Great Depression was most acute? And why is it that all of these workplaces together rise up in a single wave of sit-down strikes across the United States, but especially here in Detroit, where there's over 130 sit-down strikes, predominantly led by socialists and communists and leftists, that within the space of months completely transformed a city that was assumed to be the most anti-union in the United States. This surprises a lot of people. Los Angeles and Detroit were considered the two leading anti-union cities on this continent and had the lowest level of unionization, in part because of the success of the auto companies in destroying the basis of craft unionism and the presumption that there was no other viable form, industrial unionism, except for those of us on the left over the many years trying unsuccessfully to organize industrial unions. It succeeds in the 1930s for reasons that include the success of a movement towards social unionism, in contrast to the business unionism that I was trying to describe earlier. And it happens because that social unionism is developed over the course of 5, 6, 7 years of dealing with the community crisis of the Great Depression. The massive unemployment, which was worse here than in any other city in the United States. National unemployment in the early 1930s was 25%. Here it was about 50 to 55%, the estimates range that high. And for obvious reasons, if you're running low on money, you're going to save for food and clothing. You're not going to go out and buy another Buick. So the auto industry collapses, plummets, 75, 80% reduction in production, and employment, and the city is devastated. This is a city where there was actually people dying of starvation. That's still happening today, but it was a much more widespread phenomena back in the day, where evictions, mass evictions across the city, where there was no unemployment insurance, there was no Medicare, Medicaid, none of that existed. The presumption was that corporations would handle your welfare, and in good years they once had tried to do so, but all of that disappears in the 1930s. The crisis here is the most acute, and its response at the community level is not initially successful union organizing. There are strikes in the early 30s, but they lose. What wins is community struggles, the unemployed councils, the renters and consumers leagues, the ethnic societies and mutual benefit organizations that try to sustain what they could of a social fabric and hold people together, blocking evictions in the case of the unemployed councils. And in a way, the Great Depression was something of a leveler, where before the discriminatory practices that were endemic across this society, the racism that relegated minority workers to the worst jobs and the least likely prospects of advancement. Now, those same circumstances are starting to become endemic among white workers, and they end up in the same soup kitchens with black workers. And this is important in Detroit. Remember, in 1924, the Ku Klux Klan actually won the election for mayor in 1924 here in the city of Detroit. Charles Bowles outpolled his opponent by 7,000, but he was a write-in candidate, and they misspelled his name, so he never took office. But the Ku Klux Klan had that kind of base in this city, where strikes were routinely broken by pitting black workers against white workers. Tim Axel, the Detroit Athletic Club, where white craft unions will go out on strike and the employer would suddenly get a religion and hire a strike-breaking force of black workers. And that was their only chance to get into industries that had previously been whites only. Again, underlining the question of how it was possible that people really didn't think that the prospects for an industrial union movement were all that substantial, and why many people, in hindsight now, take it as inevitable, but it wasn't at the time. It was actually a new way of thinking, a new approach, organizing around healthcare, for example. The UAW and the CIO in its early years was organizing clinics across the city to do screening for tuberculosis, which was a major problem in the auto industry. The UAW also organized the Renters and Consumers Leagues. This is again in the 1930s, basically with radical leadership. They had their own radio stations with programming across the board, organizing around a Polish workers committee, a Negro organizing committee, an Italian organizing committee that would appeal to people on the basis of what was happening to them in the community, as well as then eventually talking about on the job. And the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, its organizing principle was, for the first time, not for the first time, but the first time successfully in the mainstream labor movement, to say, we organize everyone, without regard to race, gender, skill, everyone. Skilled and unskilled, black and white, men and women in the same organization. Now, in practice, did they always follow through on that? You bet they didn't. There was enormous issues that would continue for decades afterwards, and much of what we could talk about up here was the continuing struggle to hold the CIO and later the AFL to those high principles. But it was the first time in the first organization, in terms of mainstream American life, it was the labor movement that came out first for this argument that we are best off when we unify across the previous divisions that had fragmented people and made us much more vulnerable to exploitation. So that was a social unionism movement, saying we're not here just to bargain a collective bargaining agreement for this identified group of people, which we, in any case, have now expanded dramatically to include everyone in the workplace. We are also about representing across the board a working class. And I think that's why we understand how the sit-down strikes occurred in so many different locations all at once. Two reasons why. First of all, because that preceding organization at the community level meant that there was a broad-based community support for union organization. In contrast to what we often see in subsequent decades, where there'll be an organizing drive here, isolated, and sort of somewhat discouraging circumstances because you feel like you're alone in that regard. Now we see in the 30s a very different approach where workers from one plant are supporting the organization of people in a completely different industry. And in what amounted to a general strike from November of 1936 through the spring of 1937, as I mentioned, 130 sit-down strikes across a whole range of issues. And not just auto, but also restaurants and hotels and tire manufacturers and trucking companies and butchers and laundries. It's across the board, and the UAW is marching in support of a whole range of workers across that industrial spectrum here in Detroit. I feel like I'm running downhill.
Do you want the mics? See if you can use it.
No, that's not the problem. It's the 16 different plates I've got up in the air. And so maybe I should probably end with this. That one reason that it all happens at that time is because direct action, this militant direct action of seizing the factory and saying, we are not going to give this factory back to you until you obey the law. And the law, of course, was the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, which gave the workers right to organize, but it didn't mean anything so long as employers continued to just ignore it, believing that they would eventually get it overthrown in the Supreme Court. So the law is a dead letter in terms of the reality on the ground. Employers are firing workers, discriminating against workers, and doing all of the illegal acts, cracking skulls, employing thugs recruited from the Licavoli gang and the Perone gang. It's a nasty business. And so the workers seize the factories for that reason, and they say, we're not going to come back out. We're not going to go out on a regular strike, which allows you to just literally gun us down. we're going to hold your factory as ransom until you obey the law. It's in an odd way a law and order movement, insisting on the rights guaranteed under the National Labor Relations Act. And in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt runs for president re-election on the basis of defending the National Labor Relations Act. And a lot of the campaign is around the question of worker rights. Now, Roosevelt is a very uneven and unreliable ally in many respects, but he does represent part of that New Deal liberal revolution that includes things like the National Labor Relations Act. And so it's one of the elections that when we look at it, maybe the upcoming one might rival it in some respects. But the issue of social class, of a working class seeking its rights and power on the job, is a prominent part of the election. And when Roosevelt wins re-election in a landslide, which by the way was not predicted, the polling of that day, all of it wrong, predicted he was going to lose. And so he wins in a landslide, and the sit-down strikes begin 3 weeks later. And they begin all at once across that whole range of locations because of the social unionism, the social movements, the many social movements, socially based movements that come together in support of the CIO. I think I should probably draw the line there, and then we can talk about, and I'm sure there's folks, I know folks in this room who can add to the discussion, but that is the basis for the radicalism and the changes in Detroit politics that follow upon that decade of the 1930s, and where that movement for social unionism also starts to fragment into warring groups within that movement, but where the Democratic Party is transformed by these changes that we see in the 1930s, and the Republican Party as well. The Republican Party becomes much more right-wing, the Democratic Party becomes much more liberal and social democrat, not radical, but a substantial change from a Democratic Party which before 1948 is basically driven by ethnic politics and patronage politics. The Republican Party goes from having a wing that's, and catch this, there used to be something called progressive Republican, which sounds like an oxymoron today, but the Republican Party goes to the right, driven by the automaker money that is funneled into it after 1940. The Democratic Party, after 1948, when the CIO elects thousands of delegates to the Democratic Party, they throw out these old-timers who are these ethnic patronage politicians. They also throw out Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters, and they go over to the Republican Party. So the two main unions in Detroit, the UAW, closely aligned with the Democratic Party, the Teamsters, closely aligned with the Republican Party. They represent two very different approaches to workplace organization, and two very different claims about what's the appropriate way to try to win progressive change on the national level. We could also get into the whole issue of the Red Scare and how that compromises a lot of what I just described. But I'm running out of breath, so I think I'll sit down.
I'll give it a shot. We'll see. Kind of juggling a few things here.
I'm going to sit over here, sitting in front of that.
Is the sound level okay for the people in the back? No?
Carol, I'll turn it up.
Great. Thank you. How about now? For the people in the back row? Is that okay? Great. Good. So I thought I would try and do 5 big things that it's helpful to know a little bit about when you're trying to understand post-World War II radicalism in a place like Detroit, which was part of the subject of my, my second book, but which was my dissertation. And I love the conversation that we started with about why do you study history and what do you think a radical is, because those two things really came together when I was working on that project. I really wanted to understand the place that I had grown up. And I really wanted to understand the family and the environment of the people around me when I was growing up, a number of whom were self-identified radicals, progressives, communist, socialist. I mean, I really wanted to understand what life had been like for them and struggles and their politics. And I will say that one of the books that was really helpful for me was Steve's book, Working Detroit, which has a photograph in which my mother is there as a young woman holding a picket sign with this like really cute scarf around her head, which kind of for me was really encapsulated so much of what I wanted to try and do in my own work and what still excites me about a lot of this history. So 5 things that you take away and kind of think about. One has to do with the Great Migrations and movement itself, movements of populations. So both regionally and then in terms of urbanization. So movements of population from south to north and west, and then movements of population from rural to urban. So there are 2 waves of the Great Migration. The first is 1916 to 1940, in which 1.6 million African Americans make that journey, the regional journey from the south to places in the north and the west, including Detroit. The second wave is the much larger, 1940 to 1970, which means that it includes the post-war period, when at least 5 million African Americans are going to make this journey. So again, I mean, just the numbers, the churn, the movement of populations is really important. By the end of this period, by around the 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s, the African American population is going to be about half and half, 50% in the south, 50% in places north and west, but 80% of the African American population is going to be urban. I mean, so again, this transformation is just huge, and I think that this has a lot to do with how a lot of politics, radical politics, civil rights, activism is going to unfold in the post-war period and beyond. I think there are a couple of, the second thing to take away directly related to that is that this is a working class phenomenon. And so that largely when you're thinking about the African American population, you're thinking about a working class population, especially as that transformation from rural agricultural work to urban work happens, right? I mean, the race becomes working class, I think, in really profound ways that can be easy to overlook in some time periods, but almost consistently there from roughly the post-war period forward. And that means that the characters and movements involving African Americans are going to be working class movements. So that's the second one. So the first are kind of this movement, this churn of the population. The second is that this is a working class phenomenon. Detroit, you can see this really clearly, and those 2 things are linked as people are pulled from the south. So they're pushed by horrible conditions, racism, white supremacy, a truncated life without possibility, racial segregation, cradle to grave. But the pull, right, are these opportunities that people believe are opening up, especially in places like Detroit, which during World War II was the arsenal of democracy, right, which means that all production in Detroit in plants kind of becomes production for the war, right? Making tanks and airplanes and bombers, and so the whole city, right, is kind of having its industrial base geared towards wartime production, which means that a lot of opportunities are opening up for populations for whom that would not have been the case before. It also coincides with the very tail end of the massive unionization that Steve was talking about. So the Ford Motor Company is the last of the great plants in the city to finally unionize, and that's June 1941. I think I have that date right. So kind of the war period, right, kind of coincides with the end of that great wave that really changes kind of what it's like to work in these plants. At the same time that more the African American population is arriving in the city alongside of white Southerners, right? Which means that Detroit during World War II is just, it's a mess, right? I mean, there are all kinds of problems that are going on. There are fights in the streets, there are fights in the plants. They're race riots in the traditional sense, right, where the kind of whites and blacks are literally fighting it out in the streets. So Detroit during that time period is really trying to figure out how to make sense of a lot of different processes that are unfolding simultaneously. For black activists, black radicals at the time, there's a lot going on. So the unions are helpful as kind of training grounds for activists. I mean, people are learning about hands-on participatory democracy in their locals. They're learning about leadership. They're learning about caucuses and coalitions and kind of how do you fight, for each other. Kind of what does solidarity look like? So having this as a vehicle for activists and would-be radicals is enormously helpful. At the same time, where all of these social challenges are unfolding around the population, around really intense discrimination and racism for the black population. Which would be number 3, which is kind of understanding the World War II era and then the immediate post-war era as something that really propels a lot of activism itself. So during the war, African Americans adopted double V campaign, double victory over Nazism and fascism in Europe, and victory over discrimination at home. Right? So they linked the two, right? We're not going to fight just one of these wars. We're going to fight both causes simultaneously. Bringing that together was a really powerful engine of thinking about social change and new possibilities, and what it might mean to really be in the struggle, right, and in that way. So by the time the war ends, you can imagine there's a lot of pent-up frustration. Things have been hard on the home front. There's a lot of discrimination. There's a lot of racism. People continue to arrive in the city of Detroit that's not equipped for the population. So there are problems over housing in particular, right? So housing, thank you so much. Is going to be a real hot button issue in the city. They're returning soldiers, right, who've now fought for their country and want something better at home. They're union members and workers who have been told during the war to strike is unpatriotic, and so you cannot do it. So not surprising, there's a massive wave of strike activity in the post-war period. I mean, actually, some people argue that the wave in 1945 and 1946 is larger than any previous wave of strikes in American history. And I think it really says something about what the post-war period was like, right? Where a lot of frustrations were pent up, and people were really ready for something different, especially given the high levels of racial discrimination in places like Detroit. In fact, there's an argument that says that we should abandon sectionalism. So this argument that racism is different in the South than it is in the North. That kind of causes more conceptual problems. And that if we got rid of that, and just, so that there's some regional differences, but then the argument is that they're not that great. And so that you can kind of think of a place like Detroit as kind of up south. It is actually kind of a very southern city in a lot of ways, especially with the dynamics of racial segregation and discrimination in the city. Again, around education, health, housing, and employment would be the really big ones. So some of the things that you get fights for in the post-war period are fair employment practices, the FEPC. It's a huge issue that's bringing together activists, unionists, and radicals in the post-war period. Unions like the UAW-CIO could be both a help and a hindrance in some of these campaigns. But I think it's really important to realize how important unions are going to be in launching a lot of these campaigns. And not just unions, but labor itself Again, right, this is a working class population. And in a lot of the ways that organizations are forming and communities of activists are coming together are actually in and around labor circles. So that could be unions, it could be labor organizations, it could be the work of labor lawyers, right? So one good thing it's great to have if you're a labor radical are lawyers who are your friends and who are gonna, be able to kind of push your cause. And during the post-war period, there are a few of these organizations that are particularly interesting and important. And for those of you who might want to, kind of think about this period a little bit more, I can recommend trying to get to know the NNLC, which is the National Negro Labor Council. And I'm going to read you a little bit from my book about some of their activities and why I think this is such an important organization. And I wrote this book a long time ago, so I kind of have to read it. It's been a while. Sometimes I read it and I think, oh wow, look at all the stuff I used to know. So this is unemployment in Detroit's African American community was by most estimates at least double the average for whites in every recession of the 1950s, and there were a lot of recessions in the 1950s. And the same was true in black communities across the nation. Yet, the union movement put forth few coherent programs to deal with these racial disparities and their effects. Frustrated with this reticence, radical black unionists, hamstrung as they were by the red label, right? So this is also the period of the Cold War, anti-communist repression. It's hard to be labeled a red and still be a viable activist in this period. So hamstrung as they were by the red label, nonetheless took matters in their own hands. The NNLC grew out of local activism of black and some white unionists, particularly in Detroit and Harlem. In Detroit, Coleman Young, it's a name that people will recognize, and William Hood, the recording secretary of Local 600, which was one of the larger union locals for the UAW, were the driving force behind the creation of the Greater Detroit Negro Labor Council, which merged with other local councils in 1951. Although the national labor councils, much like the Jewish Labor Council and the ACTU, which is the Association of Catholic Trade Unionists, were union-based, they had the support of community activists, such as Reverend Hill, who's a figure that I write a lot about, and Irma Henderson, who's going to go on to become an important political figure in Detroit, as well as national figures such as Adam Clayton Powell, who was in Congress at the time, and Paul Robeson, who sang and addressed the crowd at the NNLC's founding convention in Cincinnati in 1951. We approached Cincinnati in two capacities, basically, Coleman Young explained, quote, as Negroes and black people and as trade unionists. And we dedicated ourselves to a dual role, to bringing democracy to a trade union movement, right? So to actually bring democracy into the union movement and using that trade union base to move the traditional union movement and our white allies within it into the liberation struggle of black people with a primary concentration on economic issues. So it's really interesting. This is a great organization also for understanding the intersections with gender issues. So one of the things that they really became very big at was organizing in the South and organizing black women. And so it's a really great organization to kind of keep an eye on and to know a little bit about because of what they were up to. So the third was, right, kind of an era of discrimination, an era in which unions were a helpful vehicle, an era in which unions were also a target, right? So that you had to kind of fight this duel on both fronts. Some of it is, like Steve was talking about, trying to get the unions to live up to their own potential and to their possibilities and to their promises. as a really defining thing in this period. But if unions are really important on the one hand, I think another really important vehicle to be able to understand how radical communities started to come together, form organizations, launch movements, and coalesce were African American churches. When I first started, what became Faith in the City, I was really impressed by how involved a number of Black churches were in a lot of labor causes and in radical causes. And again, I think, we think about the civil rights movement as being the religious movement. So that Southern movements are religious and Northern movements are secular. This is completely wrong, right? I mean, you just don't get it. This is another way that sectionalism kind of gets in the way. So I was really interested in the role of Black churches and how they had helped people to organize and how they were able to serve as an indigenous resource, as a place to meet and gather, as a place to be able to organize, as a place where ministers, members of the clergy could deliver powerful messages around freedom and liberation and possibility and change and struggle. And then how faith itself could come to sustain a kind of oppositional consciousness. Right? So I think in our conversation, when we're thinking about what does it mean to be a radical, right, it means to kind of be in opposition to the status quo. Right? To be able to maintain that kind of critical consciousness in that space in which you might work out other kinds of possibilities in the future. It turns out that churches were really important for that kind of activity. Let me check. So one place to kind of look for that in the post-war period in particular was called the Fellowship of Urban Renewal Churches. So one of the other big things in the post-war period that activists found themselves confronted with was the process of urban renewal, which people at the time called Negro removal. It was really just about destroying Black populations and neighborhoods. So let me read a little bit. All right, so I write. By 1962, almost 10,000 acres of quote-unquote blighted area, or 13% of the city, have been cleared under the urban renewal program. And so this had been going on throughout the post-war period. It's the early 1960s now. Roughly 57% of those personally affected by the clearance were Black. Although renewal programs were in principle racially open, most of the new housing projects were privately owned and rents were high, factors that worked against African American occupancy. What urban renewal really does, wrote the NAACP's Arthur Johnson, is, quote, to relocate Negroes from one blighted area into one that is already overcrowded, thus eventually transforming it into a slum. Right? So it was just creating more density in more slum areas. Increasingly, added Councilman Mel Ravitz, it has become an instrument primarily for the economic advantage of certain citizens and businesses who profit from investment or who may benefit from residents in the city. Part of the problem, Part of the problem came from the fact that it was unclear whether urban renewal was supposed to improve the quality of life for the city's present residents, or whether its purpose was to attract suburbanized white middle-class families back to Detroit. They're not going to return, said Black Councilman William T. Patrick, insisting that the city focus more on low-income units. But it was not just access to new housing that was at issue. Questions of equity also came into play when deciding which areas would be slated for clearance in the first place. And this is one of the things that Reverend Albert Clay, who's another figure that I write about, got really involved in and helped to create the urban renewal, this fellowship of churches against urban renewal, to actually go in and fight some of the processes that were going on, to try and derail some of the projects, to try and save churches in some of the projects. And it's one of those issues that did and didn't work. I mean, and I think it's one of those places where even in those times where things weren't working out for activists in these populations, that they still kind of used both the organizing activity and in some cases defeat to be able to back up, to assess what had happened, to find new possibilities, to create new kinds of coalitions, and to really kind of rethink what politics could and should look like in that period. And I'll read you one more, on that note, I'll read you one more terrific passage from Coleman Young. I quote Coleman Young a lot in this book because he is just a really lively, smart figure about this era in particular, which is the era that really, I think, helped to form him as an activist, as a future politician, and as a radical. So he writes, I think we overestimated the potential support of the trade union movement. Coleman A. Young lamented years after the National Negro Labor Council had been hounded out of existence by the late 1950s, mostly because of anti-communist repression. So I think we overestimated the potential support of the trade union movement and underestimated the necessity of rooting ourselves in the ghetto. We needed, Young continued, with the clarity of hindsight, in retrospect, it seems to me, a more even-handed approach. And we had an unrealistic concept of how far the trade union movement would go without organized pressure and support from the Black community. We were way out in front. Life took care of that. When the man cracked down and we didn't have but one place to go, and that's back to the ghetto. So Young was not the only person to kind of come to that realization that you had to, you know, when he says ghetto, he really means you have to go back to Black populations. You have to go back to Black neighborhoods. You have to go back to Black organizations and build a base of power there to be able to then struggle forward to get past some of the things that start to stall, towards the late 1950s and early 1960s, especially because of the waves of repression with the Red Scare. It decimates organizations. It really breaks up, some of the things that had started to congeal and to have real success in places like Detroit. And it's interesting because that's just as the Southern struggle is really getting started. And so it's really worth thinking about what that means in time, that those things are happening simultaneously. So I promised 5 takeaways. The 5th one would really be a sense of continuity. I think one of the things I was really impressed with looking at the radical history of Detroit is that there's a civil rights community that forms in the 1930s and around the Depression. There's this stuff that happens in the post-war period where things are moving around, coalitions are forming, radicals are trying to figure out how to maintain a purchase vis-a-vis coalitions of liberals and labor leaders, and so they're trying to figure out where are the spaces of radical potential. Which is why Young and some other people say we've got to go back to Black communities to be able to find that place where we can stand in solidarity and struggle. And then the next thing that's going to happen is a generation of radicals come of age in the early 1960s. And there are people like General Baker. There are people who like, the folks who are going to be involved in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. They're in organizations like the Uhuru in the early 1960s, which is a really fun organization to kind of look at and to study. It's a young people's organization, or college students. There are young workers in plants. There are people coming back from war yet again, right? Feeling that there should be better possibilities on the ground. And I think what's really great about Detroit, it answers one of the questions, which is why is it that Detroit's Black community gets so radical so early in the 1960s, is because I think that these younger people had access to a lot of the wisdom of an intergenerational struggle. So that there were all kinds of spaces on the left that opened up. The Friday night labor forums hosted by the Socialist Workers' Party, different older radicals who were teaching at places like Wayne State, reading groups, people who invited younger activists into their homes. I mean, it's a really interesting phenomena about intergenerational contact. It was not that they necessarily got along, right? I mean, there were real differences that are going to open up. But there is this sense, I think, and this makes Detroit a little unique, of a profound continuity of activist experience. Kind of that really kind of across these crucial decades of the 20th century. So I think that by the mid-1960s, Black radicals in Detroit are extremely well organized, really pursuing some smart ideas, are really grounded. It helps too to be grounded in the labor movement, which by then, right, has really matured, right, as another vehicle for social change. And I think it's a really impressive thing that people are then able to use to try and think about some of these questions kind of going forward about what the future of organizing is going to look like from the mid-1960s forward. So, thank you.
Just so we can kind of slide over. I'll slide over if you want to slide that way.
Yeah, the light from the projector was really intense, so we've been trying to avoid it. It's okay. Yep.
So thank you both for these really illuminating conversations that you've led us through. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for folks in the audience to engage, ask questions, because we've covered a lot of ground tonight, and I'm sure that there's a ton of questions out there. I've filled an entire page with questions, but I'm going to restrain myself. One of the first questions that I wanted to pose to both of you is in regards to the Communist Party and its influence in different phases of the different struggles that we're talking about. And what's piquing my interest here is the NNLC particularly. That's an organization that I'm really interested in. And of course, many of the organizers in the NNLC are at least have a degree of familiarity with the Communist Party, and in some cases were card-carrying members. And many of those members of the NNLC went on to have widely impactful roles in Black freedom struggles throughout the country. So Coleman Young here in Detroit, of course. Vicki Garvin in New York was a mentor to Malcolm X and shaped a lot of his internationalist thought. Clarence Coggins, a person that we don't really ever talk about, was an integral organizer in New Jersey and was responsible in large part for getting Newark's first Black mayor elected in 1970, which was Ken Gibson. So I'm wondering if each of you could speak briefly about the role of the Communist Party in leadership development, in organizational training, capacity building in the areas that you study. So that could be the influence of the Communist Party, which was often tenuous for Black organizers. We can go down the road of the national question. Maybe we don't have to, that's maybe another night. And also just the role of the Communist Party within the labor movement in Detroit as well. So getting an idea about this genealogy of ideologies that are shaping political thought and action. That's open to whoever wants to.
Well, the role of the Communist Party is it's an important part of what's going on, and it's impossible to understand the history of the 1930s and the decades that followed without paying close attention to the initiatives that the party is responsible for. And in Detroit, industrial unionism has its start with the Auto Workers Union, not the UAW. This is before the organization of the CIO affiliate, the United Auto Workers, that we've come to know. Before that, it was an outlier, not part of the American Federation of Labor or the CIO, which didn't exist yet, but in the 1920s and the early 1930s, the first cadre that was focusing on industrial organization that unified workers across occupational and race and gender were Communist Party activists, active in the Auto Workers Union. Phil Raymond becomes an especially prominent organizer in that regard. And many of the later UAW activists are actually their first experience with these efforts, which don't succeed in the sense of an ongoing stable organization, but they do show the way and the potential for organization that was denied by AFL and folks who regarded unskilled people of color, women, as completely inappropriate members for an ongoing stable organization. The Communist Party demonstrates that that's nonsense, and their organization during the Briggs strike, for example, 1933, Motor Products, and at Hudson Motors in the winter of 1933, stuns everyone who had regarded that sort of unity in a diverse, racially diverse, occupationally diverse workforce as impossible. They're the ones who show that it's actually capable of shaking the elite to their boots because it's completely unanticipated and only suppressed with the application of substantial police force and police power. And they actually do force many companies to rescind wage cuts. So the later UAW organizers include quite a few who came out of that AWU experience and also out of the unemployed councils, which were another initiative of the Communist Party. Overwhelmingly, there were socialists and IWW folks involved, but it was really the Communist Party that provided the sustained focus and keep going, keep pushing, even if you initially are unsuccessful. And the unemployed councils actually are also organized on the basis of open membership, black and white. And this again is important in a city where the previous decade, the majority of voters had chosen the Ku Klux Klan candidate. Now in the 30s, the Communist Party is organizing community-based efforts to block evictions, soup kitchens, with black and white membership, and each of the chapters would elect then a citywide body, and the chair of that citywide body was black. And so for many white folks, it's the first time they're in an organization where they are understood to be co-equal with minority members as well. And so these kinds of issues are things which the Communist Party was bringing to the fore in a consistent and ongoing way that was not matched by any other organization on the left.
I'll just add that, I think that what's interesting about the Communist Party is that it's another one of these vehicles or engines, pick your metaphor, of things that are going to help organize mass movements, organizing in communities, organizing in labor unions, in plants. And I think that each of these engines, they give and they take. They cut both ways, that they're heroic in some instances and deeply problematic in other instances. And so I think that what you really need is a sense of real complexity about the role of those kinds of vehicles. I think industrial unionism is one of them. The phenomenal role of the unions like the UAW and the CIO. But in one period, you can't imagine that level of social change and organizing happening without them. In other periods, they are just a problem. General Baker once told me, I think it was him, maybe I'm making this up, I want to think it was him. It was like, what does UAW stand for? And I thought, oh, this is like an old guy, doesn't think I know anything, come on, give me some credit. And cite, United. Auto workers like, no, you ain't white, right? I mean, so in kind of a later period, the UAW was a huge problem for Black organizers. The Communist Party can be seen in the same ways. In some periods, they are absolutely heroic on the front lines of fighting for civil rights and human rights. I mean, it is just undeniable, what just rank and file members of the party are doing. And the kind of education they're giving to Black community members and radicals and workers and artists and playwrights and poets, it is a remarkable thing. At other times, they really let down these organizations. I mean, during World War II, they, after a certain point, they put all of that aside and say that all of this civil rights stuff has to wait because we have to win the war. It's a really disappointing moment for the party. But I think, the more you get to know the history and working with these ideas, I think the more you can kind of bring a complexity and a flexibility to these kinds of organizations that really were essential in building these mass movements.
By show of hand, how many people have questions? Okay.
A lot of history.
I'm trying to gauge how many questions I'm going to ask, so I'll just ask one more and then I'm going to turn it over. One of the things, Dr. Dillard, that struck me as you were concluding your first go-round was a quote about spaces of radical potential. And I'm seeing in this era that we're talking about unions and churches being two sites of radical potential that we're talking about. And so I'm wondering if each of you could share some insights about where, if you're looking at the political landscape in Detroit and in Southeast Michigan today, where are the spaces of radical potential that you see from your historical vantage points?
You gotta go first this time.
So, I'm not completely sure that history can help you to figure out that kind of question. I think for that kind of question, you really need to be pretty close to the ground. I think what history tells you is that those people who are close to the ground, who are working inside of communities, working in solidarity with others, parts of organizations, that they're able to kind of bob and weave and to be able to cite where the potential might be, right? And then to figure out kind of how to move in those directions. Part of me wants to believe that Black churches still have that role to play. Black churches are tricky though, right? And they're tricky even in some of the historical period that we've been talking about. For instance, before unionization, if you were an African American worker, probably a migrant, recently migrating from a southern city, and you wanted to get a job in a plant, in the Ford Motor Company, you had to get a letter from your minister that would certify that you were good, upstanding, anti-union, right? You're not a troublemaker, right? So that the churches were actually kind of an external extension of, the employment office for the Ford Motor Company. And they were doing the kind of work of big labor. They were siding with the Ford Motor Company. They were siding with Henry Ford against what was seen as this risky new thing called industrial unionism. Not everybody was part of that system, and the people who were not part of that system were then free to side with industrial unionism and then helped become this engine of social change in bringing industrial unions to the city. So it's kind of hard to say, right? So you can have organizations like churches, and you want to see them as potential engines, again, for solidarity and organizing and social change. But even those things kind of are going to have, that they're going to be sites of contestation themselves, right? That they're things to kind of struggle over and to struggle with. And I kind of feel like in the midst of things, it's often really difficult to figure out who to ally with. But it wasn't a part of me wants to believe that there is still this potential in churches, some churches, you know, with a certain kind of orientation, churches with a certain social mission. I would argue churches with a particular kind of political theology, you know, that can be really useful in these kinds of struggles that are unfolding in places like Detroit and nationally. I hope that wasn't too evasive, but kind of interesting question too.
It's a good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer that could match, that can address it fully. I'm right now, my recent political activity has been focused around Detroit eviction defense, and I have a history of involvement with the labor movement. And one of the things that strikes me about the current period is how both churches and unions are no longer the institutions we were accustomed to for many decades, and the presumptions about what the future might look like. And I know less about the church side of it, but my impression is that there's just a lot fewer of them as the congregations have been diminished, but also as the megachurches consolidate on a scale that is astonishing to me, and smaller neighborhood congregations seem to be disappearing. And the megachurches, someone who knows more about it can comment on where they land in terms of ideology and political agendas, but my impression is that it's not good. And for unions, workplace organizing has taken on a completely different meaning in a city where, first of all, most of the auto factories are now gone, where the work has been shifted to rural and southern, and then further south still to Mexico and China. And workplace organization, as a result, I don't think it can be a reliable focal point for social change organizing. I think it has to be part of it, particularly, the teachers' unions and what they've been doing in the last few years is really encouraging, and I see that as a very positive thing. But the union organizing, the people in the streets, with the exception of things like the General Motors strike that we just had, has been around a completely different terrain, where I think, again, the question of social unionism becomes especially relevant, because I don't think you can organize janitors or fast food workers on a single workplace basis. You have to organize a labor market. You have to organize the community in the same way that we saw in that unique moment in the mid-1930s. Because there's just too much turnover. There's too much now new employment relations that include contractors and temporary workers and the gig economy, where the likelihood that you're going to work for any prolonged period of time with a single employer on a stable basis has been radically diminished. And so the whole model of workplace organizing seems to me compromised by that. And we have to think about social unionism again, a social movement in which you organize the community and the labor market on a sort of approach which has been, you see with the D15 movement, with the effort to organize fast food workers, with maintenance and janitorial employees, where the building no longer employs them. They hire a contractor, and if that contractor is organized alone, the company just goes and looks for another contractor that's non-union. The only way that Justice for Janitors was able to organize successfully was on a citywide basis, on the basis of organizing a social base that addresses people not simply as employees of a particular workplace, but as members of a working class that have a whole range of issues: housing, healthcare, and the environment. And this is, by the way, I think not to be understated, I think a lot of the future of left and radical politics is going to have to be focusing on environmental issues that demand our attention, and demand our attention on behalf of what has to be radical policy, because the status quo is destroying the planet, and that's becoming increasingly obvious. So, but I don't know how to tie all that together, so.
Although I do think it's right. I mean, you know, we can kind of see what other people think about this, but it's those kinds of spaces of solidarity, spaces that bring people together, whether that's an institution or an organization. So that you need those kinds of indigenous resources to be able to kind of generate something that might grow to approach, you know, the scale of some of these social movements in the past. And I think it's interesting to see. So you would kind of look at what are the spaces that are bringing people together. Kind of, so where, when you look across the landscape, do you see that kind of activity inside of neighborhoods or communities or organizations? And so I would really kind of love to know what people, especially people in Detroit, kind of see with that. I mean, I think the environmental stuff is true. I think, you know, Black Lives Matters, you know, was really trying to, you know, be able to pull people together in that way. I think, you know, the fights against mass incarceration, especially on the coast, especially involving young people, have been fascinating to look at kind of how people are trying to capture some of that stuff that's been so prevalent in the past. I think anti-capitalist movements are fascinating for that as well, especially those that have a sense of fun, right? A sense of joy. You know, it's a sense of, again, I mean, that's part of what solidarity is. I think friendships are really understudied in social movements, that people had these connections to each other that were passed down inside of families and extended networks. I mean, I think so those would be the kinds of things, you know, that I think if you could find those places and see if those are going to be, you know, those kinds of spaces that will be able to propel these kinds of movements.
There's a lot of, yeah.
Are you turning into the audience?
Yes. I was going to turn that question to the audience, but you can talk about whatever you feel like talking about.
Stand up. The conditions that gave rise to the beginning of unionism is not the same conditions now. And I agree with what Steve said. And it's a whole different complex type of thing that they don't need all our hands to work no more. So therefore, even the community that exists during that period of time do not exist no more. It's a question of whether or not you're going to have some water today. It's a question of, and they are at the same time that even, I know when we were in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, we could see certain things beginning to develop. And that is the attack on education and all that type of stuff, because they didn't need all those young people like they once needed. So yeah, we have to use some of the things historically, but at the same time, we have to understand what the conditions is demanding now. And that is going back in the community. That is beginning to organize in those areas. That's where a lot of us are. And all those programs, I know with welfare rights, on even a national and international level, we have to organize. We have some people that relate to us in welfare rights that is from Canada and places like that. Because all these places are being attacked just like we are here in the United States. So as far as the church, yeah, you get one, you might get one or two, you know, to get out there. But they always late on things, just like in the civil rights movement. Churches was burning and everything, and then a lot of them didn't get on board until almost a lot of those churches was gone, you know. But they not. But one thing I have faith in is that this class is going to fight back. It takes a long time in Detroit, and particularly historically, to do something. But when they begin to move, you're going to either be, you can talk the talk, but you're going to have to walk the walk at that time. That's why education and what y'all did tonight, I really enjoyed it, needs to be widened up into the community. We just had a meeting the other day around the water in Highland Park, and no understood again how much water has been stolen, not only by Detroit, not only by the state, not only by some of the city council people and what have you, and who they put the remaining of what has to happen there now. They, if we had to put a lawsuit in on their behind, they would love for us to continue to pay for what they have taken away from us. Water is gold. They are using that for the benefit of the corporation. You got that fool in Washington who even said that we're gonna have to clear the way for more capitalists to be able to dump in the water, in the Great Lakes. What does that mean for us? They've been dumping in the Great Lakes for years. But they don't care about us now. It's a slow process that is taking place to eliminate vast majority of the people that it's useless to them. So I do have faith in the working class. And I do know I might not be here, but I'll probably be a ghost somewhere. But I want to make sure that whatever I know and whatever I can learn to be able to disseminate that into the community to develop other workers. I mean, that's our duty here. And if we pigeonhole that mess, then we just as worse as the enemies that we have to deal with. It's not a, you'd be sitting up here thinking, who in the hell I'm gonna vote for coming up in November? And you look at these idiots on TV, and none of them really meet the grant. Maybe, what's his name? Sanders. No. Sanders. Maybe him. But they, instead of in the daytime, in each other. But they're developing the class to understand why we got to be together. That's going to be our job. So yeah, I think it's not, we could use some of those taxes, and I thought, what's your name of your book?
Oh, Faith in the City.
Faith in the City. Yeah, because I knew gold. I knew a lot of those people you talked about. And I had to fool him sometime. They can learn that all your mouth might be working, but it's not what the community wants, But, we have to not act like when we go into these communities, like we know everything. You don't know a damn thing about the community you might go into, because the leaders of that community, it's got to be the people in the community. But, and it's got to start from the bottom up. And not like it has been in the past. So y'all got a great job to do. And I think you can do it. You don't know that you have the leadership within you, So I'm glad you came, and I enjoyed it, and welcome back.
And we're grateful that you're going to be speaking with us next week, too. In the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to say this quickly before we got off topic of churches. And this is not directed at Mama. This is more so directed at the perception of churches in the black community. And I think to some degree, folks who are not in the black community shouldn't perceive our churches at all. Right? Because if you don't develop a snicker or a laugh around the black church if you're not in the black community. Because what a lot of these churches do is provide services that are survival programs. That after COINTELPRO ravaged some of these rival programs that were providing survival services, what was left was these reconsolidated churches who were able to actually incorporate congregations that fell behind on their taxes. Were able to reincorporate congregations that aged out. We see this in places where churches actually suffer gentrification in places like Brooklyn, where Allen AME becomes a home for Allen Memorial AME. Can't survive in Bed-Stuy anymore. It has to be incorporated. And some of the thinking goes back into that church. And so for us who organize in our community, I'm a farmer. And there's a saying, don't bother cursing your soil, right? Because if you only have one plot of land, yeah, it may be giving you a hard time that day, but that's the only soil you have to work with. And so instead of jeering at it and kind of looking at it like, oh, it's so underdeveloped, how do you compost the church? How do you see the value of the church and those sites of contestation that are in the little pockets? And maybe I'm an agnostic, I teach Sunday school, right? Because I know that the babies are there, they like to hear African drums, we sing songs, and that's where I can influence, right? And so we have this, it's a lot of churches, mega churches, it's a lot of radical churches. There's a lot of churches that are harboring radical elements. And there's a guy in Chicago, E. Patrick Johnson, who has a book called, he talks about, I think it's called Sweet Tea, where he talks about those pockets in the conservative church where even queer folks were able to assemble and protect and love and serve each other. No one even knew who they were or what they were. They were singing in the choir, they were doing all kinds of things to be a part of and contribute to their community, but they were able to organize because there were these basic services. And so sometimes I just have to caution us who are organizers who sneer at the church, the church is out organizing us. We get 80 people or 100, we think we organize, and they got 800. And they whooping you. Yeah, you sound good, but people can't eat dinner. People can't put that on the dinner table. So you're getting whooped by somebody who's putting food on the table. Now go deal with the soil that you have and commit to struggle with those ideas, with those, with those deficits and those failures and those shortcomings, but loving the people all the same and committing to work with those people to build, like Mama said, from the bottom up, no matter what.
Thank you for bringing that knowledge into this space. I appreciate it. I saw your hand as well.
You know, y'all so humble. All y'all revolutionary activists and ain't nobody got nothing to say. Y'all so humble. But look, between the Bernie Sanders lookalikes in here and the coughing and coronavirus, but we got a hell of a group, man. Hell of a group, you know what I'm saying? I got 2 points I'd like to make. I got 90. I only like to make 2. I was born in 1950. When my parents would take us down south, it was so barbaric, it was unbelievable. I mean, like I say, I always say, when they tell young people today about the barbarity of the South and the Klan and what have you, it's hard to envision. It's great they got movies, because that's hard to envision what it was like. So, like I say, when and the speakers is just great. It's great. But when people ask what made us revolutionaries in the 60s and 70s, ain't nothing changed in that sense. Exploitation breeds revolution. Oppression breeds revolution. Discrimination breeds revolution. So in that sense, even if we would have been in the void and didn't have the leaders that we had, predecessors, Carl Robeson, Fannie Lou Hamer, Medgar Evers and them, as predecessors, that, you know, the Malcolm X's, the General Bakers, what have you, they were there, but if they wouldn't have been there, the same thing that radicalized them, radicalized us. Oppression, exploitation. Like I say, I look back, and Mr. Babson, I had your book, seemed like for 40 years, man, working in Detroit. But when we was working in the factory, you haven't seen it. It was barbaric. But I'm just saying, I wouldn't have been there. I wouldn't know it either. You know what I mean? Now, I said that to say the system is rotten. It's rotten. If we steady moving and advancing, the research and development that's going on, the technology, look how great that is. They showed somebody the other day, they had a bionic leg when they tell their ankle and their leg to move, it does. And gee, what kind of advancement is that? But you look at society, look like we're going backwards. You know, the monopoly capitalist system will not let us move forward as a whole. As a part, cool. A little bit here, a little bit there. And if that don't work, they move it back. Anyway, like I said, I can talk about that. I only got one more. I'm watching the debate last night, right? Just to show the propaganda and agitation now. I know everybody got a thing on the debate, that's all. But anyway, mine is a little simple. On the commercial, can I put commercial, right? Brian, what's his name? Said we were going to say, they put the music on. The music was like the Superman music. The backdrop was red, blue, and white. I was waiting for somebody to go for the, the new thing, USA, USA. So the commercial comes on, and this was an Amazon movie that's getting ready to come on, Hunter. Now Hunter, it come on, getting them Nazis. we're gonna get them. You know what I mean? Anti-Nazi movie, you know what I mean? And just America gonna get the Nazis, we got them in World War II, and what have you. Here in Detroit in July last year, at the Gay Parade, the Nazis marching in downtown Detroit, insignias, all of them strapped. Every one of them got their Glocks, got their rifles on their back. Now, like I said, I'm 69 years old. I'm looking at this thing, I want to jump in my car and go down there because, like I said, when we was young, we was stripping their ass. That's why they got no offices. That's people don't know that today. They had an office on Michigan. They had a microwave oven in the window. That was for Jewish dwarfs. They had a gorilla. This is the nigger. And what's his name? The John Burke Society. They was walking around like they owned it. We flipped their ass. And little cowards. Little cowards. And they see all these, like I said, now I'm saying black folks, this was back then. We become a lot of black men and black women, they go doing like this, and see they couldn't carry them guns like that. You know what I mean? But I'm just saying, that's why they're not on Michigan Avenue now. But when, like I say, when I saw that demonstration downtown, being protected by the Detroit Police Department, being protected. Chief Craig got on TV the next day with so much controversy about it. Chief Craig said, the First Amendment. They got the right to speak it. They got the right to speak it. Now, they done educated the whole generation on that First Amendment thing. The parts of it that's right is right. But how do you defeat the Nazis in World War II that's responsible for the deaths of 50 million people? That's acknowledged, let alone one that didn't die. How do you say they got a right to speak? How? You know, so I'm just saying, stuff like this, study it. Study history. Listen to your older people. Old people need young people. The energy y'all got, the vision y'all got for the future, we don't quite have it, but you ain't got what we got. You ain't been through that stuff. You know what I mean? We don't go for the okie doke. They can't do that okie doke on us. You know, it make us look like sometimes we too militant or what we know what they're capable of. That's one thing I like about Trump now. They don't have it. Trump them straight, they call him everything but a fascist. They would call him every name but a fascist. He's an oligarch. He's a whatever. You know what I mean? They won't say fascism. And we watch it. People act like they wait for the goose stepping. That's the only fascism. I'm finna stop. A democratic republic, a monopoly capitalist democratic republic is just out like your hand. The democratic republic, good side is up here, if it's a good side is monopoly capitalism, and the fascism is under here. They use whichever one is appropriate. They use it. And like Bernie is telling us now, if they get in office, the system is set up in 4 years, they be thrown out, the fascists come back in. We've got to change society. Got to be a revolution. Got to be. You know what I mean? This thing got to be flipped. We don't have, and that's what we got to tell them. We will not be governed like this. You know, we citizens. We citizens. Everybody ain't some left-wing revolutionary. We're tax-paying citizens. We should not be governed like this. Shooting black people down in the damn street like animals. One black woman get a ticket, go to jail, you dead. What is that? And they're killing the white ones too. I'm just saying. But the black folks, the minorities, the Mexicans in the Southwest, and what have you, it's just like, damn. Okay, I'm sorry.
That brings us to 9 o'clock, and I think that's actually a relevant point to end on, particularly since we started this class with asking the question of why do we study history, right? And part of that is very much to protect against what you're laying out there. We need to be able to have a clear analysis of the patterns that we're seeing unfolding in our society so that we know the direction that we're heading in, and we can act accordingly before it's too late, and then we have to respond to all that all over again. Yeah, and I'll leave it there. Next week, please come back. We have a really incredible session planned in this space again in the General Baker Institute. We are going to be talking about electoral politics and its place within movement building during the civil rights and black power movements in Detroit. So we have Marion Kramer Baker coming, we have Maureen Taylor coming, we have Wayne Curtis coming, and we have Charles Simmons coming. So there's going to be some incredible knowledge that's being dropped. We have an opportunity to engage with our elders that have been through the struggles, and not to discount that there are some legendary organizers in this space. You might not recognize them. They're amongst you. I'm looking at a lot of folks in the face and seeing the years of experience and the years of wisdom in this space. So I'm hoping that everybody comes back next week and then we can pick up where we left off tonight as this series continues. So thank you all. Get home safe, and thank you again to our speakers. Get home safe, everyone.